Hi, welcome to today's Talking Wellbeing Live. Hope you're all well and having a good Monday. Just waiting for today's guest speaker to join in. Please bear with us today. We seem to have a few technical issues, but we're trying to resolve them at the moment. Hello.
Can you see me?
Yes, I can now. It worked out. Thank you for your patience, Kirat.
Oh my gosh, of course. I'm not tech savvy at all. So when it comes to technology, don't ask me.
Well, I'm glad we're both here. Just to give everybody a formal introduction, I'm joined today by Kirat Randhawa. She's a meditation instructor and a student of Tibetan Buddhism based in New York City. Her work also comprises of psychotherapy, meditation, and spirituality. Before we speak in depth about these topics, to start with, how did you train and get involved in the work that you're doing?
Oh, what a question. So I started doing this primarily as a personal practice. And I found that the Buddhist philosophy was really the only philosophy that spoke to me in the way that I needed to be met with. So it was very comprehensive and really frank, and I needed that candid approach to the suffering that I was experiencing to feel as though I could trust the philosophy. And similar to you, I grew up in the Sikhism tradition and still feel very closely connected to the Sikh faith. But it was Buddhist practice that really allowed me to develop an intimacy with myself. And I found that from there, I couldn't help but see everything through the lens of Buddhist psychology. So naturally, when I was speaking to loved ones or just speaking in everyday life, really, it was from a Buddhist informed perspective. And that led me to study a little bit more about the philosophy and especially how to communicate some of these teachings. And then all of a sudden, again, I found myself teaching. It was a very um, unanticipated path, but I sort of fell into it. And then after working with trauma informed frameworks, I realized that I wanted to go deeper into that philosophy and that sort of school of thought of really merging together trauma informed psychotherapy and Buddhist psychology. So that's what I'm doing now.
It's incredible. I think that's what we're sort of going to look at more today as well. But to begin with, what are the core principles that inform Tibetan Buddhism as a starting point? Because I know obviously there's so much depth to it, but just some foundational points that come to mind initially.
So I would say Buddhist practice as a whole, the intention behind all practices are to soften the grip on the ego. And the ego simply being defined as the solid sense of self that we project onto our experience. This sort of intrinsic existence that we project onto life is the root cause of suffering. The fact that we think that we are exactly who we are, and there's no room for adaptation, there's no room for evolution, and what we see is sort of what we get. So Buddhist practice strives to soften the grip on this very constricted sense of self so that we can experience more freedom in each moment. And freedom is relative. Freedom for each individual will be different depending on the circumstances of one's life. But generally, it's a greater sense of ease and a greater sense of peacefulness in relationship to the unfolding of one's life. So that's the essence, I would say. If I could really reduce Buddhist practice down to one primary intention, I would say that. But of course, that there's so much more beyond that.
Of course. And in terms of obviously how you work, I know you obviously do one-to-one sessions and things like that. Obviously, we can have certain assumptions about what meditation is, it being one thing. What does actually a practice with you look like? What does it comprise of?
I would say that my meditation practices are very permissive. they're very spacious. And I try to, and I aim to, and I hope this comes across, to give people a lot of permission and space to be where they are. So, traditional Buddhist practice, this isn't a popular opinion, but it is prescriptive. It's not just, the instruction isn't just to offer you a way of knowing what is happening as it's happening, but it's trying to guide your experience. And I don't necessarily resonate with that lens immediately. I think there's tremendous value in that, but a trauma-informed perspective, through a trauma-informed perspective, it's really important to release the need to prescribe anything to anybody and rather create a space for them just to come into contact with what might actually be here. So it's subtle, it's nuanced, and I like to ensure that each person feels as though they're in the driver's seat of the practice, and as if I'm not trying to guide them elsewhere or trying to force them to have an experience, but rather to create a space for them just to have the experience that they're having, but maybe feel a little bit less alone in pursuit of that.
Because I know in terms of my knowledge of meditation, like I've had experience of it within, say, a yoga practice, or what has become more popular, I suppose what's made people think more about it is in the last 10 years of having apps like Insight Timer or Headspace app. And obviously, listening to your meditations, it's a very different experience to that.
Mm. Yeah, I think the apps can be so helpful and so beneficial. And I think the question is, I think as practitioners, we have to assume the responsibility of understanding why we're doing what we're doing. It's not up to the apps or even to the meditation teachers to help to really understand your intention. You know, the apps and the meditation teachers will teach, I think, hopefully what feels genuine and sincere for them and what they feel like they can speak to in an ethical and in a responsible way. But it's up to each practitioner to identify what it is that they might need and then to go seek out those practices or those apps or those communities that align with their unique needs. Because for a subset of the population, the apps are exactly what a lot of people need. It's digestible. I think it's much more accessible given the nature of life, being busy, not being able to actively go somewhere in person to meet a teacher or to meet a community of people. But I do also find that there are quite a few practitioners that get to a stage on the apps where they no longer feel fulfilled by the services on them. Maybe they need that in-person guidance or they need community. They need to know that there are other people experiencing the same things that they're experiencing in real time. So I would say that the industry, because it is an industry now, let's call it what it is, it's a space, and it's a space where transactions are happening all the time. It's important that each practitioner really arrives into the space with an understanding of what they want, or at least the willingness to receive support to understand what they want, and let their own needs guide what practices resonate and what practices don't.
And that makes sense because, in a lot of ways, like you said, there is a prescriptive method almost, and it has become, quote unquote, an industry. And in terms of obviously, okay, about your work and being led by the individual of what their needs are and looking at where they're at, I know obviously you have a creative approach called a kind rupture. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, a kind rupture, it's a very gentle framework. Um, it's similar. I mean, it's the framework in which all of my teachings and inspiration for my classes and one-on-one sessions and other projects come from. So it's essentially guided by the principle that it's through the moments of suffering and it's through the moments of hardship that we begin to encounter something sustainable. And it really is through that very intimate confrontation with the self where we can actually begin to understand what it means to love the self. Because it no longer feels conditional. It's no longer on the premise that I can feel good or I can love myself or I can choose to be in right relationship with myself when I accomplish this or when I look like this or when I act like this. In those moments of essentially fragmentation, when we feel like we're falling apart or life around us is falling apart, there's a moment of beauty. And that's such an intimate way of knowing the self when our defenses sort of soften and the natural longing of who we are and what we really want just sort of comes to the surface with that much more ease. But it's the word rupture is in there because it usually requires a breaking open, a moment of, oh gosh, I don't have XYZ to sort of protect me in the ways that maybe I did. Whether it, whether it was a label or a person or an environment, it's now sort of me exposed and vulnerable. But that's the place in which I can really meet myself without this image of who I think I'm supposed to be.
And actually, that's a point that I've always been intrigued about is how does meditation facilitate that more in depth, the being at one with yourself in terms of giving yourself that compassion or not having such conditional worth, which obviously we can be conditioned to be, whether about society or the groups that we're in, we assign certain things to ourselves. How does meditating or even your learning of Buddhist meditation help that ease in more depth? I know you touched on it there, but sometimes if somebody doesn't know about it, it's like, okay, how could it help me with my situation or what I'm going through internally?
Mm, that's a really good question. Thank you for that. I think so. The word meditation, I read this somewhere. This isn't my idea, but someone somewhere, and I will try to find out who this was and get back to you about this. But I read something, and the author had described meditation to be synonymous with the word sport, which is what does it mean to play a sport? Each sport will have a unique goal and a unique set of tools to achieve that goal. So meditation is very similar. You can practice such a variety of different meditation techniques, and they do ultimately have a very unique state in which we're trying to cultivate. So, and that's even within a specific tradition. I mean, Buddhism as a whole is incredibly comprehensive, but I would say if I speak to the Tibetan Buddhist techniques that I practice, which is really all I can speak to, in this context, meditation is a form of mind training. It's a way of developing an intimacy with your moment to moment experience and an intimacy with how you relate to your moment to moment experience. So that relationship right there can offer us tremendous insight into what we might be doing or saying or thinking that perpetuates suffering and invite us into a new way of relating to our moment to moment experience that might be able to soften the causes of the suffering that we experience. So essentially, in one sentence, meditation offers us a choice. And that's what I mean by freedom. It's not that we don't experience pain and suffering. Newsflash, that will never happen in life. And that's okay. It's okay because so much I think of the striving in meditative practice comes from the avoidance of pain and this impatient quality of waiting for suffering to end. But I have found in my experience tremendous freedom in just expecting there to be unpleasurable experiences and painful moments, and rather training myself to not panic in the face of that and maybe to gracefully land into it in a different way. So that's sort of my perspective on how meditation can be an ally in really leading a life of more ease.
And thank you for sharing that, because even I might have held the assumption previously that meditation can almost alleviate some of that suffering rather than being with it, if that makes sense. Sometimes we can go into certain practices with, okay, I need to control this rather than be with it, work through it. And that can also inform my feelings and my thoughts.
Mm. Yeah, I think Amrit, that's such a popular perspective, and that's not entirely wrong either. Ultimately, and ultimately, I'm speaking lifetimes of practice. The intention is to eradicate the source of suffering, and the Buddhist perspective is that that ultimate source is the grasping onto this fixed sense of self, this identity that we think we are, and how everything then that continues to cause us suffering stems from that initial grasping. This, though, is is a long process. This is a sort of healing trajectory that is intended to take lifetimes. Who knows how long you and I have been doing this kind of work? This could be my 10th lifetime. This might be my first. I don't know. But my perspective and the Buddhist perspective is that this isn't supposed to be a short-term solution. But even though we might not be able to eradicate the source of our suffering in the next 10, 20, 30 years, maybe I can be with it in such a way where I cease to cause myself more unnecessary suffering. And that's the distinction there, in that there is the sort of normal amount of pain that we experience in life, which is inevitable. But then there's also a unique kind of suffering, which the Buddha described as unnecessary suffering, which is when we relate to the suffering in such a way that we make it worse. So if you're having a bad day, for instance, and you're stressed out and you're tired and you're hungry and life around you is feeling chaotic, that already is bad enough. We all know what that feels like. But if we relate to it by being critical, by expecting ourselves to be balanced and graceful and not panic in the face of great distress, now we're just perpetuating the suffering. So rather than just being compassionate and saying, I'm not resourced enough to cope with what's coming my way, and that's why I'm having such a difficult time, we start to place these extreme standards of who we think we're supposed to be and how we think we're supposed to respond. And that's where the suffering really begins to continue.
That kind of narrative that we may have internally as well, whether it's come from us or outside, that we need to, I guess, put suffering in some sort of box. I do appreciate, of course, in sort of psychotherapy work, everybody wants to alleviate some form of tension or stress or whatever they come with. But we have become almost in times of wanting to have a quick fix. I think that's what can also make meditation, I guess, a bit of a grey area for some people. I know I've had people respond and say, okay, they have a bit of hesitancy to meditation, or, okay, to look at it from another perspective. Meditation, if you're feeling anxious or you've had certain types of trauma, the argument could be it may be quite frightening to sit with that. What would you recommend or advise in those kind of situations if someone is feeling that way in terms of meditation?
I think that that's such an important question, and I really wish that this conversation was happening a little bit more in the health and wellness space, because I think this is a lot of people's experience. I think, especially post pandemic, a lot of people have unexpectedly had to confront things that they maybe otherwise would not have confronted. But given the conditions of being alone and maybe not being so busy, it's the perfect storm for things in the past to really arise without any mediation from busy schedules, other people, life beyond our own minds. And, I would say that meditation isn't intended to be a practice for everyone to feel better. So we have to be really clear about the intention. So I hold strongly in my mind that meditation is not a practice for relaxation, but a practice for transformation. So it's okay if you're at a stage in your life where you're not looking for liberation or transformation or really this higher way of being in relationship to your experience. And higher, I just mean a more elevated way of thinking. it's okay if you need to ground and to soothe and to relax and to soften back into pleasure and safety. That is an incredibly valuable and significant aspiration. So then I would say it's coming back to your intention, really understanding what the goal is and finding practices that work for that. Because mindfulness meditation initially had nothing to do with feeling good in the moment. It was ultimately to liberate yourself from the source of suffering so that you could attain a state of awakening. And liberation, I heard this somewhere, so this isn't me, but I heard someone say liberation is not the same thing as feeling calm. Liberating yourself is not the same thing as grounding yourself. So if it's liberation that you're after, this awakening, this freedom, then the practices will look different. But if it's grounding or settling or finding a moment of peace where it's not too much confrontation, where you're resourced enough just to get through the day instead of focusing too much on everything else, then another practice might be more suitable. And that's okay. So I think I would say in moments of that, there's no need to force yourself to meet the practice. If it doesn't feel good and it doesn't feel helpful, why do it? It's supposed to be of service. And if it's not helping you and it's not being beneficial to the goals that you have, then it's okay for it not to resonate right now at this stage.
Because there can be a sense of that, almost forcing yourself to go through a certain practice. Okay, yes, we're talking about meditation, but it could be another well-being mindfulness approach. And just thinking, okay, I need to stick with it, even though at that moment, like you said, you may not be resonating with it. I know it's obvious, but sometimes we get frustrated at our inability to feel more still or to feel more calm. And I feel that that sort of spirals, it becomes almost like a loop, it becomes bigger and bigger for the person.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really well said. And there is a discomfort that arises with meditative practice that is normal and that is expected, which is confronting yourself and confronting the neuroses that have been driving the mind is never going to be a pleasant activity. It will be challenging and it will be wildly uncomfortable. That is the nature of growth. However, if it's strengthening your dysregulation, if it's causing you to panic more, if it's causing you to feel immensely overwhelmed, that's different. And this is where it gets very nuanced and where I think sometimes the lack of in-person care or personalized care, even if it's not in person, can be dangerous. Because if you're on an app, even if you're in a group meditation class, the teacher won't know what you're experiencing because you're not having that one-to-one experience. They have no idea what's happening to you, especially in the age of Zoom. When I teach a class, most people have their cameras off. I don't know if you're having a panic attack or if you're having an experience that has come up from your past. I have no idea what's happening. And that's why it's really important for both the instructor to be incredibly permissive, to constantly give the invitation that if this genuinely doesn't feel doable, like it's activating something to the point where you're becoming dysregulated, stop. Wake up, open up your eyes, get some water, move the body. There's no reward for pushing yourself past your threshold. That's not an admirable thing to do. It's an incredibly dangerous thing to do. And at the same time, offer you enough support and guidance so you can check to see, is this just discomfort that I don't want to feel? Or am I entering into a territory where I don't have the resources to regulate myself in the face of it? And that's the difference. Do I feel resourced or do I not? If you don't feel resourced, then I would strongly advise to stay where you do feel resourced and you do feel like you have the capacity to still regulate yourself.
And that's so valuable to know because, like I said, we may think certain practices we've just got to push through it. And last time we spoke, that's what we also did touch on, that in this conversation, as much as we want people to know about the benefits, we want to raise their awareness about the meditative practice and about Tibetan Buddhism. It was also about looking at the reality of, okay, where are the limitations? or what can be some of that nuance as well that sometimes we don't speak about enough? Because I think it'd be unwise for us to have a conversation where we just outline the benefits, but also not outlining, okay, these are the parts that maybe you need to consider. Okay, what is your personal experience? And like you said, when you feel not regulated or you're feeling a sense of panic and anxiety.
Yeah. I'm really thankful for the questions that you're asking, because I do think this is why the collaboration between Buddhism and psychotherapy is so fruitful, because there are certain questions that psychotherapists will naturally be inclined to ask that might not even cross the mind of Buddhist practitioners who don't have a psychological foundation. And that's okay. They both offer tremendous value, but they have a distinct way of meeting the psyche. And both, I think, are necessary in today's world. And a question like this, in terms of how do we know when it's not working or too much, is when a certain amount is too much or enough, is something that isn't really spoken about in traditional Buddhist spaces. And we as a community, we as practitioners, or even as maybe instructors in the space, can continue to create more dialogue around this, where we're asking questions that are uncomfortable and we're meeting the practice in a nuanced way, and we're allowing people to have their own relationship to the practice, and we're not telling them what it has to feel like to meditate and what they're supposed to be doing for the practice to work. There are guidelines and there are key techniques that are crucial to doing it right and to making sure that you're not causing yourself more suffering. But that always has to be held with spaciousness to give people the autonomy to relate to it in the way that they want to relate to it.
And I think that's so key, because whether it's psychotherapy or even certain wellness practices, there needs to be a level of accountability. And also, as you know, as I know as well, we have ethical boards and things like that that can keep us in check. But the individual who comes to us or certain practices may not be aware of those things.
Exactly, exactly. So I think the more conversations like this we have, I think the easier it becomes for practitioners everywhere to understand that there is a little bit more room in their relationship to introspective practices. And if something isn't working, adjustments can be made so that it does feel good and it does meet them where they are. So I'm really thankful for even you and I having this conversation today, because I wish that when I had started meditating, given my own unique experiences that I've had in my own past, that I had someone to tell me that it's okay if this isn't actually helping you right now, that this might actually be making it worse. And I didn't know that was even possible, that my meditation practice, all the way that I was relating to it, could actually be making it worse.
And thank you for sharing that, because I think it takes a certain level of honesty as well as a certain courage, because there can be and kind of like I said, we were joking about this last time, that you can get on almost like this wellness train, and then you don't actually allow yourself to be critical as well or have critical thinking in it.
Oh, I've been there. I've been there where my relationship to meditation was the reason that I was suffering more. I was so tightly wound up in what I think I was supposed to be and what an appropriate practitioner is supposed to look like and practice like, that I didn't realize that I was cutting myself off from being human and letting life touch me. And it's an incredibly painful place to be. And I think it does make me sad that I see a lot of people in that state now who, by no fault of their own, I think just due to the collective pressure now to be well and to be healthy and to take care of the mind, that if we're not feeling that way, or we're not using every free moment to optimize the self, that we're failing. But ultimately, optimization is about leading a life of fulfillment. And if there's not room for nuance and pleasure and just space, that's not a fulfilling life for me in my eyes. And I have had to learn that the hard way.
too. I think it's quite ironic sometimes that we try to get almost perfect at our wellness practices, whether that be get perfect at therapy or we get try to get perfect at a meditation, when actually it's allowing that space. Or some days you're gonna struggle, and okay, it's okay to struggle as well, and it's okay to have some resistance, maybe to your therapy session or your therapist, or have some resistance to your meditation practice, and that's okay to be curious with that and to allow that.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a really important invitation to become curious about the resistance. Or I've noticed if I've been practicing a specific technique for a certain amount of months, and then I wake up one day and I do it, and it doesn't quite feel the same way, or I don't quite feel that like I'm being held by it, to make that the object of my practice. Oh, what is that? Rather than getting frustrated that I'm not having the same experience that I had yesterday or for the last 3 months, what would it be like to now bring my attention to this resistance? Let the resistance guide my meditation. What's it like just to follow that and soften that? And we might be surprised at the intelligence that is always present when we sort of sit back and just learn to listen to ourselves instead of constantly imposing our will.
That's definitely something to take in. I'm also mindful of the fact that a few questions are coming in, so I'll actually ask you some of those as well. If anyone did, okay, just going through them. What does a Buddhist perspective on karma and how does it relate to wellness?
Ooh. um, so this is a pretty comprehensive topic, so I will keep this short, but um, essentially karma just it's neutral, which I think is very misunderstood in the West. Karma just isn't something bad that happens to you as a result of a negative action. Karma is just action. It just means that every time you do something, there's a consequence to that. Positive, negative, pleasant, unpleasant, it's not really the point. The point is that when you do something in the world, there will be a reaction to that. So, from the Buddhist perspective, and this is unique to the Buddhist perspective, all karma, if you have any karma, even positive karma, you're still stuck in samsara, which is you're still stuck in the cycle of suffering. This is where it gets very nuanced because the Buddhist perspective would argue that ultimately you want to free yourself from any seeds of action. So there's nothing coming into fruition that keeps you bound to a material existence. This gets really nuanced and complicated, so I won't go more beyond that. But the way that I think it can relate to wellness is just recognizing that every time we do something, we're planting a seed. Whether we're consciously doing it or not, a seed is being planted of thought, of energy, of movement, whatever it might be. So if it is that we want to reap the benefit and we want to reap the sort of consequences of more positive, wholesome, supportive, joyful conditions, then we have a responsibility to plant those seeds. But if we're planting unwholesome causes, then we are going to experience unwholesome conditions. That's sort of the simplistic way of looking at it, but nonetheless, I think it can be helpful in allowing us to recognize that we have to be thoughtful in how we move throughout the world. We don't have a choice.
I hope that gives you the answer, James, that you were looking for. I'm just sort of screening through, seeing if there's any more. Um, oh, okay. There's is meditation compatible with? I'm assuming it says with relationship with your partner. Once that transformed person, is there even space for the relationship? So I'm assuming it's saying if somebody themselves has, say, transformed or changed through their relationship with meditation, how does that, I guess, work in relation to the relationship, I'm assuming?
Um, this is such a fascinating question. Um, it can 100% work if you want it to. Meditation is simply going to clarify what you want and what is good for you. And if it's what you want and it's good for you, then it's fine. But if through your practice you realize that it's not what you want or it's not good for you, then that's insight that you can make a decision based off. So I wouldn't think too much into I wouldn't get stuck on what it's supposed to look like to meditate. If you're meditating and you're evolving and you still feel like you're in a loving relationship and you feel supported and you feel joyful, there you go, you have your answer. But if you're evolving and you feel like you're not resonating with your partner, you guys aren't traveling in the same area of your lives, you're not growing in the same way, and you don't feel like you can meet each other with that awareness and that support, then that's a decision for you to make. But I don't think that if you're on a path of actualization or introspection that your partner has to be too for it to work. And I would invite us all to consider the variety of ways that people take care of their mind through music, through art, through food, through travel. It doesn't have to look the same way.
Mhm. It actually made me think when you were speaking about that, people will say similar things when they come to therapy or they do any kind of personal development. That if I go through therapy or if I do personal development, how will it impact my relationship? Will it have a negative effect or will my partner be encouraging? What we always say in therapy as well is the fact that you're coming to therapy for you. You're coming to therapy to possibly look at how you relate to others and how you show up in spaces. You can't come for somebody else necessarily. You can come for the way you frame things or the way you sit in relation to those feelings. But like you said, if there's something there already, it's always going to be there. But it's more not the fact of meditation or the therapy space will cause friction. It may cause you or allow you to see certain things from a new light and perspective. But it's usually, like we say, it's something that is already there as opposed to something that has been put in by the meditation or the therapy.
Exactly. And, I, just like you and I were speaking about the resistance, I think that it's really helpful to make the fear around diving deep into one psyche the object of attention. It's such a universal experience to be afraid of evolving for what we might outgrow. It's an incredibly painful experience. And I think every human being can understand to some degree what that might look like. Outgrowing a job, a community, a friend, whatever it might be. There's a level of I'm naturally evolving in my life through my conscious will or not. This is just where my life is taking me. And I'm afraid of what I might have to leave behind. But if we can reframe that into an opportunity to know ourselves more intimately and to create the conditions for freedom, for joy, for fulfillment, then part of meditative practice becomes, and this might be the hardest part of it, to trust that whatever reflects freedom, joy, and that balance for us is for us. And whatever doesn't might not be for us. So trusting that if we can allow fulfillment to be the goal, our life, if we're consciously moving throughout our life in that way, will take us there. So rather than getting focused on the means to the end, just hold the aspiration in your hand and trust how life takes you there. That's why it's the hardest, because we have to let go a little bit, and no one likes doing that.
That is definitely something that's challenging to sit with. And so we don't want to deny that experience either. I think, especially given that so much is at our fingertips, right? We're a generation of if we want to order something, we get it the next day. We want to fix things very quickly. Sometimes it can feel very difficult or very painful, very challenging to sit with that feeling of the unknown
Mm.
or sit with the feeling of, oh, okay, I might not be able to control this immediately.
Mm.
There's that space, right? Before we can even make a decision if we want to make any.
Yeah, I think you spoke really beautifully to this before by, I think you labeled meditation as the gray area, and that's exactly what it is. It's nuance. The brain doesn't like nuance. The nervous system doesn't like nuance. The nervous system wants a yes or a no, a right or a left. But meditation is like, no, It's either or, both and. That's meditation. We live in the in-between. And it's a practice of becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable, with not needing things to be a certain way in order for us to experience the peace of this moment. And that might just be the hardest thing about being human.
Completely agree with that. I'll just ask you one more question before we wrap up this session as well. It's how similar are Buddhist and Sufi approaches to mindfulness?
So, mindfulness is traditionally a Buddhist practice. The the word mindfulness, the traditional definition mindfulness comes from the Buddhist tradition. Um, I don't know much about the Sufi tradition beyond some of the poets that I've read and teachings that I've heard, so I can't speak to that from an informed perspective. But just to help the community understand, mindfulness did originate from the Buddhist tradition, even though the technique isn't intrinsically Buddhist. I mean, people have been doing this for thousands of years. Before the Buddha ever existed. But the unique way that he communicated the teachings and sort of put them together was his teachings and continues to be, and that's what he did so well in his own journey to awakening.
Thank you for that. I hope that answers your question as well, James, there. And also, finally, I wanted to actually personally know, how has contemplative training impacted your well-being and mental health?
There are so many things that I could say for this, but the thing I will say is that I I'm no longer afraid of myself, and I'm no longer afraid of taking refuge in myself and trusting that I've got me on my own 2 feet, with my mind, with my breath, that I can rest there, and it's a safe space that I can be, and it's a space that I can trust and that I can rely on, and that no matter what, I have my own back. And by virtue of relating to my own experience with a little bit more ease, I can create the conditions for more freedom. So I would say it's a, which might sound counterproductive because ultimately it's to release the clinging on the self. At this stage in my life, very, very early on in the process of meditative awakening, it's allowed me to develop a friendship with myself that I'm really happy with, and that I really wanted for a long time.
It's incredible. And for anybody who is considering sort of getting involved in a meditation practice, what would you want to say to that person?
This is something that I've echoed a few times throughout the session, but I would be really clear about your longing. Be clear and sincere with why you want that. Why do I want to meditate? Why do I want to turn inward? And whatever it is, that's okay. There's no judgment, there's no right answer. But let your genuine longing for why you want to do this guide who you study with, what practices you find, and where you go to fulfill that aspiration.
Thank you so much, Edith. How can people reach out to you, whether on socials or in person?
Feel free to message me on Instagram. I think that's probably the easiest thing. I'm always traveling out and about, but I'm based in New York, and I come quite a few times to the UK each year. That's my home originally. So if you're around there, let me know. But otherwise, feel free to message me on Instagram, and I'm always happy to chat. And Amrit, thank you so much for this conversation. I want to do another one, but me interviewing you because there's so much to learn from you.
Thank you. I'm happy to do that at any point, Gita. It's been wonderful. Like, we could just talk and talk, really. I'm mindful like the time sessions that we have on IG lives, but definitely I'm more than happy to join in a conversation from a psychotherapy background and how we can look at some more different topics. Especially, I would love to have a conversation in more depth about trauma and how it can show up.
Definitely. And I'm just reading some of these comments. If anyone has a question, just message me and I can get back to you on there. And sorry that we couldn't get to all the questions, but thank you everyone for being here. And Amrit, thank you so much for all of your beautiful, insightful questions.
Thank you. I'm very grateful. And I will definitely put up any links of how everyone can reach out to you underneath the feed and when we share this video as well. So know that any questions, they will get answered at some point by Kirat. But we're very grateful for all of you joining, and take care of yourselves.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.